Welcome to another episode of the Girl About the Globe podcast. In this particular episode, I'm joined by Phyllis Kaplan, founder of Sawah Bali, an NGO in Bali, to discuss the underbelly on this popular Indonesian island. If you're planning a trip to Bali and you want to know how to become a conscious traveller before you visit the island, this podcast episode is for you. Stay tuned. Welcome to Girl About the Globe, a podcast for you, the solo female traveller, empowering women to travel solo with maximum adventure, minimum impact. Welcome to another episode of the Girl About the Globe podcast. Today I'm joined by Phyllis Kaplan, founder of Sawah Bali, an NGO in Bali, to discuss being a conscious traveller on this very popular Indonesian island. Hi Phyllis, or Fifi, welcome to the podcast.
Nice to meet you, Lisa.
I'm really excited to have you on because I think we're just going to talk about so much stuff today. But before we actually dive into Bali, which is where you are at the moment, tell us more about you and where did your love of travelling first begin?
Well, I think we have to go back to the lucky set of parents I had. My parents, my father was a traveler. Both of them were incredibly curious. And so they thought nothing of when I was a child, taking me out of school because they felt traveling. This is pre-globalization. We're talking about the 60s and the 70s. Globalization really didn't hit for America until the 80s or so. And therefore, or rather, we were exporting it then. We were already in the midst of consumerism by then, but really by the 80s. And therefore, they took me to not just the usual places, i.e. Europe, Western countries, but my father really loved to go to what we would call developing countries. And so this is very early on. I got it wasn't out of my comfort zone to be traveling to these places, no matter where we were. And he had a very strict way that I would have to do research prior to travel. In other words, I had to understand the geography, the geology, the economics, the political scene, just everything that contributes, and the language, of course. And I had to learn at least hello, goodbye, and thank you, and please in the language where we were going.
Right.
He was, this was serious, and back then, we had private guides because that was the way you traveled. You had a private guide. And of course, a private guide was a person who was learned from that country, but also spoke English so that we would understand. But we were able to gain entree into very unusual places because of this, because we weren't traveling in a tour, so to speak. And that's how I began to travel. And when I was 16, I spent 4 months in France and then went traveling afterward. I was living with a family, but then traveled all around Greece, et cetera. And then in college, at 19, I was studying in Italy, and that actually fomented a huge overland trip on my own solo. From Italy to really India, Nepal.
Amazing.
Yeah, so it is still, it's always been a passion. And I like slow travel.
Yeah, I think that's the best way to immerse yourself, isn't it? Slow travel. When I was younger, I used to do a lot of fast travel and I used to travel very differently. So I feel that my traveling style has changed quite a lot over the decades. But I love what you said about having to learn a few phrases of the language, because I really think that goes a long way. Even if you only know, like you're saying, just the basics there, I really feel that the locals really appreciate that in every country that you go to.
You're so correct. That's accurate, because no matter where you go now, if you address them not as the other, but someone who wants to join and understand a little bit more, and are curious enough to just get these basics done, it really, you're correct. It's very appreciated.
So now you're in Bali. How did you end up in Bali, and why Bali?
Well, when my daughter was ready to go off to college in 2009, I had already decided years before that I would also birth a new life as she was, and I would travel the world volunteering. And the first place I went to was a place I had been to before, which was Costa Rica, and I was working with the very large macaws in an area of conservation in which these birds had been taken out of their natural habitat, and we were breeding them so that their offspring could go back to the Osa Peninsula, etc. It was a lot of really hard work. So I was doing that, and my closest friend from college was in Bali, and she just said, "Where are you going next?" And I said, "Well, and she kind of convinced me that I would just love the culture here. And even Costa Rica, of course, is an extraordinary place of natural beauty.
Yeah, probably one of
And
the top
so
ones.
many different habitats. And, but culturally, it's not all that strong, as there's only one area that have indigenous people, and that's on the border of Panama, on the Caribbean coast. So it didn't offer, which I am always so fascinated by, cultures and religions. And so therefore I said, "Oh yeah, I'm coming." So I went to Ubud, which is always been known as the cultural center of Bali. Very refined and very extravagant and opulent, compared to the rest of the way the Balinese live their lives, which is through the practice of Balinese Hinduism. This is their daily lives are really lived through this way, but it's through its practice, which are giving offerings, daily offerings, and prayer.
I went to Bali a long time ago, but that's one of the things that I do remember is seeing the offerings outside all of the temples. Yeah, that was one of the first things that struck me about the island. Now, since I've actually gone, I think tourism there has exploded, and especially for people who love yoga, writing retreats. Obviously, it's got the party vibe as well. It does seem to be an island that has everything that you need, and I think is really good for solo travelers.
I will say that you touched on something that was kind of the start of all the changes. After that, the book called Eat, Love, Pray, Eat, Pray, Love, Eat, Pray, Love. That's how familiar I am with it. But I will say that when the book came out and the movie came out, it became just an extraordinary amount of single white women surged onto the island. And it's never stopped since then, but because it is a safe place, it's been a safe place. That's one of the first things I always need to find out for myself as I travel. Is this a safe place for single women to be? And but getting back to that is that the map, when you saw the map of Bali, it always had Saraswati, which is the goddess of knowledge and all the arts, and it was all the arts. And when all of that happened, it got replaced by a symbol of a yogini. It was very
Really?
in Ubud. Yes, the map changed, and it was kind of like, oh. So
Oh,
yes, there is a lot of yoga in Bali, and there are places that you can find also Indonesian practitioners finally, as opposed to only Westerners.
doesn't that go to show how influential one book can be? Because surely the infrastructure on the island doesn't cater for that many travelers at some points of the year.
Well, I'm going to tell you something that's very, it's almost unbelievable. But as you know, most roads in Bali, except for the one highway, is really geared for it's one large road that actually fits two. You can sometimes do two cars, but often with all of the buses that now come, not only from the domestic tourism, but also from just people on tours, you've actually got to find some place to pull over. So, because the roads aren't wide enough, and if you remember Bali, the roads are lined with temples as well as villages and homes, and it would be truly impossible to do that, to widen the road. So, one of the unintended consequences of all of this has been 5 million cars a day on
Really?
this little island. I wish I could tell you, I can tell you how small it is. It's really even, it's even smaller than our smallest uh, um, state in America called Maryland or Rhode Island. It's even smaller than that. And as I said, the population itself is uh, close to 5 million, but there's 5 million cars because there's so much um, traffic due to its proximity to Java. Java is only 2 miles away from Gilimanuk, which is the north western part. So there's a lot of traffic here, and it has eroded the sense of place, which to me, that was why I was attracted to Bali. Its sense of place, its identity was so strong.
You feel that's been threatened by tourism over the years?
Yes, and there's also been, I don't know if you've read about it, but since the Ukrainian and the Russian marched into Ukraine, there has been a huge scale of migration. I'm not going to call them refugees because they're coming here very well heeled. And there's the sad part about this group is that they cut the Balinese out of their lives. They build these insular places that have all their services and their villages and everything, and they could be anywhere, but the Balinese are nothing. It's really an exploitive kind of it's just a very exploitive way to live here, and I consider it neocolonialism because then their services are only for them, and this is a very, very big, huge impact on Bali, and that is because Jakarta desperately wants all the foreign currency. The rupiah of Indonesia is not a stable currency. So they love when other currencies come in. And I would say most of the Russians that come in are coming in with either US dollars or euros. And this is this has made a detrimental impact on not only the environment of Sawah, meaning rice paddies, but also on societal fracturing.
So it's completely changing the landscape in more ways than one.
In society, because they're not contributing toward anything for society. They're leaving. The only person that's benefiting is the person that's leasing them the land to build these huge enclosures for themselves.
That's such a shame, isn't it? And I know you've started an NGO, haven't you? Obviously to help the Balinese people, and you collaborate with farmers on the island. Tell us a bit more about that.
Well, that started when I first came here. On my second day of walking around Ubud, of course, I wanted to walk into the Sawah, which are the rice paddies. And by then, there are huge swaths of them. But as I began to walk, I saw a building in the middle of prime agricultural land. And I'm like, what is going on? So this is 2009, 2010, right? And I'm like, what is going on? Why is this? Why this is prime agricultural land is for food security. It's not for building. And by building, when you put a building on Sawah, which is what it's called, you also have all of these negative impacts using the house needs to have a bored well, which is taking up the Subak water. The house itself has a lot of shade, which is disallowing the rice to grow well if it's shaded. There are a host of problems, And what's happened is, so when I saw that, I didn't understand. I didn't understand why that would happen, because all around the world, there's no more land left, and so most countries save their agricultural land for food. And but I learned as much as I possibly could. And then in 2012, the UNESCO World Heritage site was designated in Bali. And what was the designation? Sawah and Subak. And Subak is the water delivery system, but it's also a spiritual vehicle. They're two things, and it's over 1,000 years old. And Bali had this technology. I mean, it's been proven. In Java, they don't have the same technology as the Subak. Of course, they have water canals. And Bali is just far more productive in rice production because of it. And when this happened in 2012, those of us in the know we had great doubt that this was going to be successful, because UNESCO designates, but it's up to the country itself for its protection. So the protection of the Sawah and the Subak had to come from Jakarta into Bali. Right. Bali does have special autonomy, but that was never done because of there was a major conflict there. Bali has a mono economy. This is almost 100 years old now. About 1930, it really started from the Dutch. The Balinese never chose tourism as their economy. It was foisted upon them. And tourism has a conflict with exactly the same needs that agriculture needs. Agriculture and tourism needs land. Agriculture and tourism needs water. And this is what's happened. And I think you know who's winning out. In other words, tourism is winning. And I've seen tremendous changes in the 15 years here. I mean, let's put it this way. When I came, Bali had less than 10 years, Indonesia had less than 10 years of democratic rule. And now we're on to, over 25 years. And what's happened through tourism has totally changed the profile of the island and what the island is. And it's changing. Modernity has come extraordinarily quickly, really quickly. So one of the reasons when I started Sawah Bali was to really be able to give also young people an opportunity to regale in their identity, their Balinese-ness, because this is what globalization does. Globalization's first thing that it does, as you know, if you travel, is squash culture.
Yeah.
And replace indigenous. Instead of drinking tea, you're going to drink Coca-Cola or all these other things.
Yeah.
And that's why, that's the book I have written about. I talk about my love of Bali and my complete immersion in Bali, from being enchanted from my first day here and so curious. But I also got to understand its underbelly very, very quickly. Very quickly. And it wasn't until, as I said, I came in 2009, 10, and then by 12, I started the feasibility after the designation to start this Yayasan, this organization, because my background is in land conservation. I have a lot of background in it.
Yeah.
And that was, I also had it, it was also zoning and planning, all these things, not only for me professionally, but it was in my family's lingo, from my father and my uncle's business. So this wasn't just a crusade. I mean, of course, it was a crusade of ignorance in the sense that everything had to be done through law and reverence to religion and respect to law. And, but I had seen this done so much and been part of this in America through what's known as land trusts. And land trusts are throughout the world. Unfortunately, they don't exist here.
That's such a shame, and I didn't realize that about when a site is considered UNESCO protected. I didn't realize that it's still up to like the Indonesian government to protect that. And just because it's got that label does not necessarily mean it's going to be protected. So that's very interesting to know. And I guess if you've got the conflict of interest with them wanting more tourism, the tourism dollar and euro, then it's a bit of a struggle between the local people on the island and what the Indonesian government want to attract, I guess. So it's amazing what you're doing and the fact that you've started an NGO, because I've traveled a lot and Bali is one of those places where I realize that it's very sacred. It's a very special place and it's got a very nice kind of energy to it. And they do have a very sacred relationship with the land and the water, don't they? So it does seem like a shame that is being, I can't think of the word, that is being threatened by tourism.
Yeah. You mentioned water. The difference, one of the differences, but the prime difference between Balinese Hinduism and Indian Hinduism, although they share a lot of the same sacred books, is that for puja, for prayers, India uses fire. But in Bali, we use water and that's why it's called Tirta Agama. In other words, it's the religion of water. And that's why another reason when I talk to you about Subak, why it is part of the cosmology of Bali and the animism, but also the underpinning of Balinese Hinduism. And this, they still, no matter what is going on, as Clifford Geertz, an American anthropologist who used to teach at Columbia in New York, no longer alive, called the Balinese the manifestation of the existential, because it doesn't matter what's going on in the rest of the world, and rarely does the reality puncture this world. The Balinese have inside of them their religion, and it is truly practiced every single day, as well as the ceremonies, which are nonstop, which really were what keeps me here. That's what keeps me here. The indigenous practices, no matter what is going on. And this is very much a middle-class society now. This is a developed island compared to the rest of Indonesia, and that's why there's so much transmigration. Everybody from all the other islands want to come here and work.
Okay.
But Bali has been able to retain, despite colonialism, even though there's a new colonialism now, a neo-colonialism, which is not just from the Dutch, but from really how the Balinese have to still be in certain ways subservient to the white skin. And that's atavistic. That's in the body. That's something that they carry with them.
I noticed that I went in 2001, which is a long time ago, and I'd have to go back to see how much it's changed. But I noticed that back then, actually. Yeah.
I'll just tell you a little anecdote. When my daughter first came over, she used to come over. She was in college, and she'd come over for a couple of months and always do some volunteering here, usually teaching English to students or etc. But when we would go into Ubud, I was living in Ubud at the time, and to get her some clothing, we'd go into a store, and all the sales girls would come over to us, and they'd start touching her very black frizzy hair. It's like, we call it a jufro. Her very frizzy hair, and her skin was just porcelain. I mean, her skin is totally porcelain. And of course, we are touching their hair, which is luxurious, black, straight hair, and their skin so brown and so soft and hairless, totally hairless. And, it's just, again, that old platitude, that old thing of just, you always want what you don't have.
Yeah.
But for them, they came from feudal society, all these things. They were always had someone who was either colonizing them or invading them, or and don't forget, as we all know, most of Islam, Indonesia is an Islamic country, and Bali is a very, very small, minute, only Hindu island. So there's always the threat now, really, very, very badly. I will say another thing, not just the Russians, but there is the threat that this island could no longer become the majority of Balinese Hindus.
My goodness, that's really sad.
That's where a lot of the investment is coming from, also from Jakarta. There's a lot of corruption. There's a lot of money laundering that has had to be done. You get bags and bags of money, got to put it into something tangible. Well, Indonesians can actually buy the land here. We as foreigners can only lease. So this is also, there's a lot of things that are invading at the same time, and that could that are intransigent, in other words, that could really change, really flip Bali.
Let's hope that doesn't happen, but it's, yeah. I know one thing that I did read a few years ago was, and it really saddened me, was the amount of plastic that was in the sea. Is that
it
still
is. That actually comes at that time. That actually happens during the winter months here, in other words, and that has to do with most of the plastic coming from Java ending up on but believe me, literally within the last month, there is some comprehensive recycling going on. But don't forget, for millennia, Balinese used a banana leaf to eat from.
Yeah.
They wove it into a bag. They carried things on their heads on it. And so when all of a sudden Indonesia is this oil producing nation, and what is the the offset, or the offshoot rather, of producing oil is plastic. And everything has been discarded for plastic. It is against the law to actually use for stores to give out plastic bags now. But Bali has fantastic laws, a lot of them from the Dutch. There is zero enforcement on anything on this island except for drugs. You do not want to be caught with illicit drugs or manufacturing them, because there's the firing squad. It's and they do not make any, they don't make any compartmentalization between marijuana and meth or heroin. So if you're caught with marijuana, so it's that they're very serious. They're very serious about.
That's good to know.
But I do want to talk about why I'm here.
Yeah.
In other words, because I think there's a really good reason why I don't live in the United States. The country of my birth no longer resembles anything. And from what I grew up with, there is such lack of humanity there. And it's only been bifurcated even worse through late stage capitalism and the huge difference. What made democracy work in America? This was, the great proposal, the great experiment. And what made it work was because we had over 50% of citizens in the middle class. That has changed in the last 6 months. The middle class is now below 50%. And therefore, a lot of it, and that has to do with also the breakdown of all the institutions in America. They're all broken. They're all failing. I tell my Balinese friends, they all want to come to America. They all see it through Hollywood movies. And I try to explain to them, truly, it's not there. It's not that. I said, you get sick over there and you don't have insurance. You can't go to a hospital, and you don't, the money that will, that's just the tip of the iceberg. But the lack of humanity in America, this whole individualism, rugged individual, you're having problems, pick yourself up by your bootstraps. It's not working. It's not working. And even though I lived in a the most humane state in America, Vermont, and I lived in Burlington, which is, has a lot of social underpinnings to it. I couldn't live there anymore.
Yeah.
I couldn't live there. And that was also part of the whole idea of looking where to go while I was traveling and volunteering. And for Bali, they have a saying called Gotong Royong, which means mutual aid, mutual help, for sukha, happy times, and dukkha, very sad times. It's real. It's very, very real.
It sounds like you've definitely found your place there.
I have, and I'm lucky because I have fantastic Balinese. I live with Balinese. I live in a village where it's all Balinese. I only have really just a couple of expat, and these are people that have lived here for 40, 50 years. So are also very much interwoven into Indonesian and Balinese society.
And you've actually written a memoir, haven't you, on your tales of adventures and misadventures?
Yes.
That celebrates the beauty of Bali and the indigenous people who live there. What made you decide to write that? Is that because you fell in love with the island and the people?
But I also needed to show people that Bali was not what they thought it was. The title of the book is Microcosm, the omen of a small island overrun by globalization, neocolonialism, and white entitlement. An NGO's tale in Bali. So this is also an indictment of, I see it truly as the beginning of what's happening. People coming in and taking and using the natural resources and the human resources for their own exploitation, their own, whether it's an organization, whether it's a country. I mean, this actually does happen on, through the World Bank and things like that. Countries become totally indebted. This is what China is doing right now with its roads and bridges completely. It's been doing it for over 10 years throughout the world. And there is, as you know, a transition that's going on there is a new world order now. China now has a greater GDP than US or Europe. So we haven't even spoken about climate change, or climate catastrophe. But yes, the Balinese, as I said, are a very welcoming people. They're very funny. They always bring humor to everything. And I have found it, I have found my families here, my Balinese family. And we're very commingled in many, many ways.
I love that. And obviously, it's very cultural. And why? Well, first of all, what tips do you have for somebody coming onto the island to make a
Mm,
positive impact on the island with
thank
everything
you
that's
for
going on?
asking that.
And also,
Well,
why? Oh, sorry.
yes,
And the second part of that question is, why do you feel it's important to be cultural? I think you've kind of answered that, really.
I think it's a matter of respect. The
Yes.
way Westerners dress here, I've given up. I've had to give up. People walk around in bikinis, and if anybody knows Ubud, we're out, or we're an hour and a half away from the beach. You know, it's not like, the very highly touristic places that were built around resorts, etc.,
Yeah.
down in the south. But it's it's really there. No one wants to know about the cultural norms, and I think that's so important
Yeah.
before you come into a country. You
Definitely.
can look, and the things that you don't know. I mean, I made so many mistakes. I still make gaffes, but for I always look to see how the women are dressed in the country. Right? Very easy.
Yeah.
And for Bali, that means your shoulders are covered and your thighs are covered, because those are the erogenous zones. Um, the other thing is learning the language. Very important to incorporate. Very important. Very important. Uh, and it's hard, especially as you become very much older. But culturally, I think it's very important not to come in entitled. Just because of you have a few bucks in your pocket and you got white skin. I mean, the way people are treated. And a lot of the sad part, the reality is many people who come to live here as expats or people who come here are actually what I consider economic refugees. These are people that can't make it in their country anymore. Australians, perfect example. They cannot afford to live in their own country. So they come here and they can live very well on their pensions. And by that, I mean leasing a home and having a housekeeper and having a cook and having a pool and blah, blah, blah.
Mm.
So it's, it's a lot of hypocrisy, but, the government doesn't care. They want investors. They want people here. There's no personal agency. And that's the saddest part here. Although one hopes things are going to change with some personal agency. We'll see if the Russians have any impact on this. But that is, culturally, I I don't leave my little village, my traditional village, more than a couple of times a week. I love just staying here. It's very quiet. Um, it's very quiet. And to address something regarding the plastic, this
Yeah.
is a very this is important for people coming here, because for years Europeans weren't coming. They just could not take all the garbage. And the garbage was strewn everywhere. And by everywhere, I mean whatever kid or person was eating, they'd just go like that with it. And the rivers are clogged with it. Two things have happened. Number one, during the pandemic, in which people were starving because they had sold their sawah and they had no jobs in the mono economy, there were some very celebrated initiatives for bringing in plastic, big bags of plastic, and trading it in for rice. In other words, it was a bank of plastic, and in return, you got rice, which, of course, this is rice culture. That's what they live on. And so after the pandemic, things are pretty clean here. Pretty clean. Not perfect, but completely different for anyone who only has recollection of the extraordinary trash everywhere, especially after an upachara, which everything can be recycled. The chenang are made out of natural materials. What can't be recycled are the single serve Danaman water, the water cups that's everywhere, which is all plastic. And, this is one of the hugest companies in the world, Danaman, who does the water. And they have not done anything about that. There's nothing for it. So those are all other aspects. But I am here for the culture, and I am also here for the warmth and the acceptance and the fun of the Balinese.
I think that's what attracts people as well. So just to summarize your points there, it was to look at the cultural norms, look at what the local women are wearing, keep bikini wear to the beach, which I do believe you should do in most countries anyway, even though obviously Europe and Mediterranean is a very different story. But and also be very careful with your single-use plastics, and just respect the environment and respect the local people. Would that be right?
I also would hope that people, when you live in a homestay, which is what I did for 8 years, I lived in a homestay.
Wow.
And I loved it. I loved it because I was told, this is how I learned all about the religion. Excuse me, there were two men on the Sawah Bali team that taught me so much, and still do. I learn something new every day. But living in a homestay is just wonderful. You really, this is the island of Santai. In other words, relaxation. And the Balinese are great at it. And they don't have regular hours to eat and regular hours to sleep, because you never know when an upachara is going to be. Sometimes you're staying up all night, or sometimes you're preparing for 2 weeks. And, it's a very, very different kind of experience. It's the total, opposition of Western life. East meets West. And this is where you get a really better understanding through observation and learning through Balinese also. So I think that if you want to come for a resort, that's fine, but also make some time to live in a family compound, because you'll get everybody. So during Sawah Bali, we had many volunteers come, and we always place them in a homestay, hundreds, if not a thousand. And they always said, and they were all ages from all over the world, and they always said the best part about coming to Bali was living in the homestay, because they're so inclusive. The Balinese want you to do this. And then if they're going on a trek somewhere, they're going to want to take you go all around the island with them. They're just naturally inclusive, and they're very, very proud in a lot of ways, and not proud as they do have pride in being Balinese.
That's great, isn't it? Before we start wrapping up, are there any other words of wisdom that you would like to add?
Before you come, or when you come, you don't use your phone just to look up TripAdvisor as to where's the best place to eat Western food. Don't do that. Don't do that. I just got my first phone 2 years ago. I've never had a phone before. I still don't use it. Be an observer, and then after you're an observer, join in if a participant if you're interested. But go to the things that wherever you are, wherever you're staying, every village has upachara. Stay at a homestay. Get to understand why Bali is really special, and why and how this culture has endured occupation and everything else. And of course, every religion, and their culture, by the way, is their religion. And every religion, as we know, goes through reformation. And Bali is going through reformation now. It's Balinese Hinduism. But that doesn't mean that there isn't an extraordinary amount of authenticity that you can partake in and be amazed.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And where can people go to find out more about you, Phyllis, and also about your NGO and your book?
Okay. So right now, you can always go to, and this will also give you, the person who would like to come to Bali, it'll give you a lot of information.
Right.
It's www.sawah Bali, SAWAHBALI.org. And that is a comprehensive website. There's also a volunteer website that Chakra manages. And that's a whole other story, and that you'll find out. I'm not going to give out the clues. But do come to Bali, but please don't have a fixed idea of what it is.
Be open-minded. Thank you so much for joining me today, and I'll put the links in this podcast episode, and I wish you every success in the future, and I have everything crossed that Bali retains its sacred place in this world.
Lisa, it's been a pleasure to talk in depth about, I believe, what's important to me about Bali. And I have to say, whereas I have done a lot of reading on subject matters, this is experiential. And there's nothing more wondrous than experiencing a country, a culture, a society that way.
Thank you, Phyllis.
Thank you.
And you can find out more about Phyllis and her NGO at sawahbali.org. That's SAWAHBALI.org. I'll be back next week. In the meantime, don't forget to download the free Girl About the Globe app. It's an exclusive discount app for solo female travellers. You can download it on Google Play or on the App Store. Just search for Girl About the Globe, and it's free. And I'll be back next week. In the meantime, safe travels. Thanks for listening to our Girl About the Globe podcast, making solo travel easier for you. Find everything that you need for your solo travels at girlabouttheglobe.com, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss an episode.